Kia ora people, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be reviewing Ikiru, which is a Japanese film from 1952 directed by Akira Kurosawa. I've been trying to get myself to watch more classic films recently, and I'm currently working my way through a bunch of Kurosawa films. Ikiru was actually an inspiration for the 1971 Hindi film Anand. Ikiru tells the story of Mr. Watanabe, an office worker in some random government department in Tokyo, who finds out he has stomach cancer and only has 6 months left to live. Mr. Watanabe has lived his whole adult life doing the same mundane job in this bureaucratic office where they don't actually achieve anything. So when he's forced to face his own mortality, he goes on a journey of discovering what life is and what it actually means to live. The film is really touching and personal. You end up feeling a lot for this character. The opening is really intriguing. Again, like Rashomon, it teases you with the promise of an interesting story. There's this voiceover that talks about Mr. Watanabe and how he's the protagonist of our story, but how his life is a bore and he isn't really living. The same voiceover tells you that he has stomach cancer, but he doesn't know it yet. Within the first few minutes you're intrigued, you wonder what's going to happen to this guy. And what makes it interesting is the discrepancy between what you know as an audience member versus what the character in the film knows. You know something that he doesn't. There's this really great sequence early in the film where a group of women from the community try to put in a request to have a really polluted section of their neighborhood cleaned up and have a playground built there. Every time they talk to someone at some counter in some random office building, that clerk points them in another direction and tells them to go see another department. The poor women run around for ages trying to get this done by talking to the officials, but eventually they're just told to submit a proposal in writing. It's this really fast-paced sequence that goes on for a while and ends up being quite funny, but it sets up that everyone in this government just pushes paper around and nobody actually achieves anything. Nobody is living. The really unique thing about this film for me is the structure. With that premise and the beginning, you think it's going to be a straightforward story about a guy who learns to take action, to take charge of his life. Despite having cancer, he's going to go out and do all the things that he's always wanted to do in life. And at the end of the film, he either triumphs and cures his cancer, or he dies, but having changed and understood the meaning of life or something. But the structure of the film is really engaging because it's so surprising. It's basically split into two distinct halves. The first half is a pretty standard linear narrative that shows how Mr. Watanabe deals with the news of his cancer. He goes out with this random guy he meets and he parties his night away. But then he finds that really unfulfilling, and so he hangs out with this young co-worker trying to figure out what makes her so lively and passionate about life. At the midway point, at the end of this first half, Mr. Watanabe dies. We don't actually even see his death. We skip forward like 4 months and the narrator just announces that 4 months later, Watanabe dies. The second half of this film is his funeral, where Mr. Watanabe's colleagues all discuss him and argue about his life. This second half also has a bunch of flashbacks that show moments that take place in the 4 months that we skipped. It's slowly revealed that Mr. Watanabe went out of his way to get that community playground built for the women from the beginning. The second half is great because of the way it surprises you and it makes you feel quite passionately. I found myself getting really frustrated at the characters at the funeral. There's this deputy mayor character who ends up taking all the credit for building the park, even though it was pretty much all thanks to Mr. Watanabe. When he leaves the funeral, the rest of Mr. Watanabe's colleagues keep talking about their memories of him, and they're kind of talking shit about him for the most part. Talking about how maybe the reason he found a lot of vitality and vigor later in his life was because he was having an affair with a younger woman. Again, you're getting frustrated because of the discrepancy between what you know and what the characters in the film know. Then after talking shit about them, they piece together their memories of Mr. Watanabe and come to the conclusion that he actually knew he had stomach cancer and that was the real reason he spent the last few months of his life trying to do something with his time, rather than just pushing paper around like he had done for the last 30 years. As they're getting more and more drunk, they start talking about Mr. Watanabe kind of like a god, and how they should all endeavor to live like he did in his last few months. I was pretty much thinking to myself, whatever, you're not going to change. And sure enough, we see the next day, nothing has changed. And again, they just stamp papers and push them around. This two-part structure with the flashbacks in the second half is a really unique way of showing the journey this character goes on, and it keeps you engaged and interested. As I kind of touched on, I've been watching a lot of Kurosawa films lately, and it's cool to see the same actors play really different characters in all the different films. Mr. Watanabe is played by Takashi Shimura, who is the actor that Kurosawa collaborated with most in his career. This is my favorite performance by Shimura that I've seen so far. It's gut-wrenching. You really believe that this guy is about to die, and you really start to feel for him. There's this beautiful but really sad moment in the nightclub where he sings this old song, and it's so sad and moving that everyone in the nightclub stops to listen and watch. He sings this same song later on in the film in this really iconic shot where he sits on the swing in the park that he gets built. But this time, it's sung in a more happy way. It's really moving because it's the last time you see him and it's just before he dies. The production design of these bureaucratic offices is so great. There's these piles of papers and files that are so huge they tower over the characters. They're huge compared to the people in the frame, and it feels like the workers suffocating the workers. There's this great shot where the camera booms down behind a stack of papers as the character sits down behind them, and at the end of the shot you can't see him anymore. There's so much meaning in this shot without any words being spoken. People always talk about how visual Kurosawa is, and that's just one good example of it. I feel like this is one of those films that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. The questions the film raises for me are around what makes a good life, what exactly it is to live, and the consequences of sticking to your guns and living your own truth. What I took from it is that to live a fulfilling life, you gotta do good things just for the sake of it, rather than for approval from others or how you're perceived by people. Most of the funeral in the second half is them talking shit about Mr. Watanabe, so that says to me that even after you're dead, people can misinterpret the stuff that you do. They might think you're doing it for the wrong reasons, or they might judge you out of jealousy, or they might even use your legacy for their own goals. I think the film says that we should do the things we want to do anyway, because when Mr. Watanabe was actually on the swing at the park, he was happy. For the first time, despite still having stomach cancer, he's fulfilled and content because he went out and did something with his life. He persevered even in the face of all these obstacles. For me, at the end of the day, the film is a really moving and eloquent way of saying YOLO, you only live once. I also read a couple of things about how some people have interpreted this film as praising individualism. The way that Mr. Watanabe sticks out like a sore thumb at his workplace and goes out of his way to do his own thing. To me, this film doesn't feel like it talks about individualism, because the thing that Mr. Watanabe sets out to do is literally serving the community. It's got nothing to do with what he wants himself. If the film was about individualism, he would probably quit the job and go do something that would only serve himself. But instead, he's using his position to serve the needs of the community. So if anything, for me, the film supports collectivist and communal ways of living rather than individualism. But that's just my interpretation. Have you seen Ikiru? What did you think the film was trying to say? Leave a comment down below and let me know what other Kurosawa films to watch.